Today, we have a fascinating guest joining us, Kylie Sandland. And if you ask her to sum up her career, she'd tell you that she's someone who's driven by an insatiable curiosity about people. Over the past 3 decades, Kylie's worn many hats. She's been a leadership coach, a business psychologist, and now a design psychologist. In the corporate world, she's dedicated her career to help leaders unlock their potential, build thriving teams, and foster cultures where people genuinely want to be. So, whether it's through coaching, talent strategy, or psychological assessment, her focus has always been on authentic and sustainable growth for both individuals and the business. So, Kylie's story doesn't stop there. And through her social enterprise, Design for Hope, she's combined her lifelong passion for interior design and her deep understanding of psychology. Using trauma-informed design, she transforms spaces like women's shelters, social housing, and community centres, creating environments that are not only beautiful but healing. It's about dignity, hope, and empowering people to rebuild their lives. At the heart of Kylie's work is a profound belief that our spaces shape our feelings, behaviours, and connections. So when we design with intention, we create environments where people truly thrive. So please join me in welcoming the incredible Kylie to the podcast. Thank you so much for today, Kylie.
Oh, thank you, Emma. Thank you for asking me to be on the podcast.
I was so inspired by the work that you do, and I think that more people need to know that this exists, and there are people like you and organizations like yours going out to really help women, especially in our world.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. It's actually, I think there is a big education piece around it because design psychology and trauma-informed design, it's a pretty new field.
Yeah.
And while it's based on decades of research in various fields like neuroscience and environmental psychology, pulling it together and then translating that research in a practical way to help people,
Yeah.
that's actually quite new, and that's what we're all about.
I love that. I love that. Well, I'm going to ask you some questions today and
Sure.
really hopefully it showcases your journey to everyone and really gives them an insight into what you do. So I understand, like from our previous conversations, that your daughter's experience really sparked your passion for design and its connection to well-being. Can you share that story and how it led to Design for Hope's mission?
Sure. It's always interesting, isn't it, to look back on your life journey and connect the dots and figure out how you arrived at where you've arrived. But I guess the trigger for my journey in design psychology wasn't a very positive one. It was actually through my own experience of trauma. And that was as a result of my youngest daughter becoming very unwell, and she was around 3 years old, although she'd been unwell for quite a while, but ended up being hospitalized. And it was a very long and difficult journey to diagnosis because what she has is very rare, and there was a lot of time in hospital,
Yeah.
surgeries, and lots of health crises. And we juggled all this with our jobs and with two small children. And so it was really quite a drawn out and traumatic time for my family. And in the midst of all these ongoing issues with my daughter's health, I turned 40. And for my birthday, my parents wanted to gift me a reading chair. So something comfortable for me where I could just go and find some peace in the midst of the chaos of my life. So I began to search for the perfect reading chair. And, that sounds like a pretty uninteresting thing. But it was actually, that search for something that was comfortable and something that I liked to look at was what developed a real interest for me in design, and particularly color and pattern and texture, which I discovered gave me a real sense of joy and also a connection with a more creative side of myself because I came from a very scientific background. Psychology is a very rigorous profession. So I really enjoyed that sort of creative aspect. But it was when that chair came into my home
Mm.
that I started to recognize the effect that it had on my mood. And the way that, the soft green color and the velvety texture and the effect of that on me and how that soothed me. So I really started to explore other ways that my home could help bring me that sense of comfort. Because I guess, when you're in the midst of trauma, having a bubble bath or, telling someone to have a massage, it just doesn't cut
Mm.
it for self-care.
Mm.
So actually finding a way to help myself, I found that through taking care of my home and, making it look better and feel better.
Yes.
That was what felt like taking care of me.
Yes.
And that gave me a sense of peace despite everything that was going on. And I think it also gave me a sense of empowerment, like I could change my environment and that could change
Mm.
myself and it could change, how my kids were feeling.
Yep.
So I think that was really the starting point for my interest in understanding the link between our physical environment and our
Well-being.
well-being. And so a long time after that, I started a business with my business partner, whose name is Jane Baxter, and it's called Design for Hope. And our mission is to restore the dignity and well-being of women, particularly those who are at risk of homelessness, through trauma-informed design. And women my age are one of the fastest growing cohorts of people experiencing homelessness now through all sorts of things, often through domestic violence, through divorce, through addiction, all sorts of things. So
Yes.
that's our mission, and that's how we got to where we got to.
What a wonderful mission. What a wonderful
Thank
mission.
you.
So, and obviously, Design for Hope, you mentioned earlier, uses a science-backed framework. So, for that trauma-informed design, what does it mean in practice, and how does it differ from traditional interior design?
I think this is such a great question because I think that there is confusion around, what interior design can deliver. There's also confusion between design psychology and feng shui, for example. So, if we look at traditional interior design, it's focused on aesthetics, the way that something looks. And a good interior designer is also concerned with the functionality of a space and how that can bring more ease and flow for the people who use the space. And there's certainly an art to applying the elements and principles of design in a way that's pleasing to the eye, but also creates a certain mood or, it's appropriate for a particular function. But traditional interior design isn't based on scientific research into how human behavior and emotion and even the way we think
Yep.
is impacted by those design elements and principles in the physical environment. So for us, using a science-backed framework in practice means that every design decision that we make is made intentionally to achieve a particular emotional or behavioural outcome for the people who use a space. So depending on the purpose of the space, outcomes that we might want to achieve include reducing stress,
Mhm.
rebuilding in dignity and a feeling of empowerment, or, in a work context, that might be enhancing collaboration or productivity. So the science-backed framework and tools that we use, I have created, and they're based on published scientific research, as I mentioned, mostly in the fields of environmental psychology and neuroscience.
Oh, wow. I love that. Like it'd be so interesting going through that process for you as well and building
Yeah,
out and obviously
yeah. Uh,
impact.
I guess my background in building has been in building frameworks for
Yeah.
organizations. So frameworks that support people to thrive. And so that was something that really kind of flowed for me, was building frameworks and tools to help people thrive in the physical environment.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now you partner with organizations like Catholic Care, Dulux, and Luxaflex.
Yeah.
How do these collaborations work and what role do they play in your project success?
Yeah, so there are some really amazing organisations who are really walking the talk when it comes to social responsibility, and making a positive impact in the community. And some of those organisations are Catholic Care and Dulux and Luxaflex and Bunnings. There are also a bunch of smaller, less recognised organisations that we've worked with, like Rotary and the Granny Flat Foundation, Women and Children First, WageX. So there are a whole stack of organisations who are doing really great things.
Yeah.
Um, the way that we work is that we're a social enterprise. So that means that while we're a business and we get paid for our work, we also work pro bono or low bono on projects in the community, such as renovating refuges for women and children who are fleeing domestic violence, because we've recognised there's a real gap,
Mm.
and a real need in that space, a real financial gap, I mean, and a real need in that space. So that's a really important aspect of our mission.
Yes.
Ultimately, our goal is that we become successful enough in a business to be able to also donate our profits. Right now, we're donating our time,
Hmm.
and energy and a lot of other things, but we would also like to donate our profits eventually. And an example of how we collaborate with these organisations is that a couple of years ago, we partnered with Catholic Care to renovate one of the refuges that they manage called Erin's Place.
Yes.
And this was a really significant renovation. So it was an entire house, 5 bedrooms, 4 living areas, an office for staff. It was a huge project which happened during COVID, which created a lot of complexity. But we worked with Dulux, Luxaflex, Bunnings, and other local organisations who all came on board.
Yep.
They didn't just donate materials, but also donated their labour to complete that renovation. And when we do a renovation, it's like the block on steroids.
Love
It's
it.
crazy because it's really important that we don't disturb the routines and the flow of the residents who are in the space. So we come in and um, it really is the block, but the
Wellbeing.
block, yeah. So it's pretty crazy, but we've since partnered with Dulux and Luxaflex again, as well as the Granny Flat Foundation and Rotary. And that was for a renovation project for the Women's and Girls Emergency Centre,
Yep.
that
Yep.
we completed at the end of last year. So we're always looking for more organisations to help bring these spaces to life because we can't do it on our own.
No, you can't. Isn't it wonderful? Like, I love hearing these stories because they are truly like with everything that's going on in the world
Mm.
right now, it's so nice to hear that there are such caring and beautiful humans ready to give their time and
Absolutely.
yeah, and resources to help make an impact.
Yeah. And it's not minor. We
No.
had when we did our first renovation at Erin's Place, we had Dulux come in and it was a 3-phase project. So that was, the block times by 3. And each time we had, 10 or more Dulux staff
Yep.
working with us. And, Luxaflex comes in and they put in blinds on 15 windows. The last project we did, we had 13 windows in one space that
Wow.
were really hard to kind of put blinds into, and nothing's ever a problem. And we're working with individuals who really care.
Yep.
And it is really nice to know that it's not just all about the money for these
No.
organizations. They really do care.
Yeah, I really love that.
Mm.
So you've worked with some really diverse not-for-profits. Can you share a project that highlights your impact and the unique challenges you face? Like you touched on it when we were talking about different organizations that come in, but can you go into it a little bit more?
Sure. So, to understand the impact of our work, it's important for us to be able to complete a post-implementation review of our projects, because design psychology and trauma-informed design is still an emerging field. And because we come from that kind of scientific framework, it's important for us to actually know properly
Mm.
that what the impact is. So I'll tell you about a project where there's been a long enough time gap for us to be able to go back in and evaluate the impact. And that's the renovation of Erin's Place, the women's and children's refuge that I mentioned earlier.
Yep.
So a year after completing that project, we went back in and had some conversations with people and received feedback from the staff who work on site at Erin's Place. So they're there and they're observing everything that's going on, as well as residents who had experienced the before and the after of the renovation. So for the residents, they love the aesthetic transformation. You know, they made comments like it was like staying in a five-star hotel, or I feel like I'm in a home magazine. But the most important feedback from them was about the psychological impact.
Yep.
So I'm just going to read off some of their quotes, so
Yep.
from their words, because I feel like it's their words that actually are what people need to hear, not my words. So some of their words were that the new spaces lift up my spirits when things get too much. The transformation makes my child and I feel at home. Homeliness is a very important aspect of healing. Um, it helped me to feel that everything was going to be okay. It was so beautiful. It helped me get in the right mindset. When I saw my bedroom, I felt worthy. I was thinking, is this really for me? Now, for us, building that sense of worthiness is our ultimate goal, because when women understand their worth, they are less likely to return to an abusive environment. And on average, women return to an abusive relationship 8 times before they finally leave or something worse happens.
Wow.
For us, it is about creating that sense of worth. So that feedback for us was really powerful to let us know that we were on the right track in creating this framework and this tool, because during that process of renovating Erin's Place, that was when I was building out this framework and doing the research.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
and other feedback we got from staff was really interesting as well. So they said that the mood and atmosphere amongst residents had become lighter and happier and less stress. And that's a good thing, because then they can connect better with each other. They can connect better with their case worker. So it
Yeah.
was really kind of de-escalating stress and helping residents to self-regulate, which
Yep.
is so important in that healing journey. They gave us feedback that the spaces were being more fully utilised and enjoyed. So they weren't just sticking to their own room, they were coming out and using the spaces more. They were taking better care
Yep.
of the spaces. Before we went in, it was a bit of a disaster.
Yep.
Um, Parents or mums are coming in a bit dysregulated themselves, and
Yeah.
so they find it hard to help their kids to regulate, and then that translates to the space,
Mm. Yep. Yep.
not being taken care of. But
Yep.
one of the really unexpected pieces of feedback, which we've since realised is really key, was that the staff themselves were much happier and more productive working on site at the refuge. So whereas before they would avoid it, now they're very happy coming in. And I think that's really interesting also for organisations to understand,
Yes.
when they're trying to get staff to come back into
Yes.
the office, how important it is to actually look at the physical environment as an aspect of that.
Yep.
Um, yeah, so that's, I guess, an example of the impact. But in terms of challenges working with not-for-profits, which I'm sure you've experienced as well. A lot of the not-for-profits we work with have a tighter budget for renovations than
Yep.
organisations who've got a lot of money.
Yep.
But by its very nature, interior design is a very involved and expensive process. So it takes a lot of time. It requires the purchase of materials and products that just keep getting more and more expensive. So
Yep.
it's challenging to work with a tight budget, but I feel after quite a lot of projects now that we've found a lot of ways to spread to stretch that budget. Working for not-for-profits, and also our tool helps not-for-profits to prioritize where they can make the biggest psychological
Impact.
impact.
Yeah. That's
Um,
wonderful. I guess that, and those partnerships with the other organizations make a big difference to that too.
well, obviously, and we can't
Yeah.
do it
No.
without those other organizations. But yeah, and I think the other challenge is that a lot of organizations just don't know what they don't know when it comes
Yeah.
to the impact of the physical environment on their clients, on their staff. It's subtle and it's complex, and it's a relatively new scientific field. So
Yeah.
for us, it really is also about building awareness in the general public of the value of looking at the space and how it can impact well-being.
Yeah, I love that. And so you're talking about that space and well-being. How does the environment impact well-being, especially for people in crisis? And what tangible examples show how your designs have made a difference?
In terms of impact, the environment impacts everyone's well-being. So it doesn't matter what your life experiences are. You would know if you walk into a space or, for example, an easy to relate to example is when your house gets a bit cluttered, and how that makes you feel and how that can make you feel stuck. And once it gets tidied up, you kind of feel more productive and
Yeah.
motivated. So the environment impacts well-being for everyone, but for someone who has experienced trauma, there can be heightened sensitivity to surroundings. And I think it's important to note that most people actually have experienced some form of trauma in
Yeah.
their lifetime, whether that's trauma in their childhood or, trauma from divorce or trauma from the death of a loved one or trauma from a traumatic event. Most people have experienced some kind of trauma,
Yeah.
and that causes us to have emotional triggers.
Yes.
And those and what can happen then is that the physical environment can then trigger a trauma response, um, particularly for people who are in the midst of crisis. And that's why we do focus on organisations who are working with clients who are in crisis.
Mm.
But for anyone who's been through trauma, they will have triggers, and the environment can trigger those
Yeah.
triggers. So one of our design goals, in terms of looking at how we can practically support people and their well-being, is to identify and remove any potential trauma triggers
Okay.
in a space, and that will help support healing. So I'll give you a couple of examples
Mhm.
of specific trauma triggers. So we've recently renovated a therapeutic room that's used to run aftercare group programs at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation centre. It's a residential rehabilitation centre. And part of our process is to audit a space for issues such as trauma triggers.
Yeah.
And one way we do that is by consulting with the people who use the space. So we really develop a deep understanding of what specifically the triggers are. In that particular room, there were two triggers that really emerged from our audit process as being really important. One was that there was a two-way window with a reflective mirror surface. So it wasn't being used as a two-way window, so no one was observing people when they were in the room from the other side. But it was causing a lot of discomfort for people who were attending a therapy session in that room,
Yeah.
partly because it made them feel unsafe and exposed, but
Mm.
also because they could see themselves in the reflection, which made it very hard for them to share their emotions. So we were able to find a really neat design solution to that problem.
Yeah.
But another trigger in that particular room, which we may not have realised had we not sort of undertaken our audit process, was that the room is also used for visits, where mums will get visitation with their children. So their children will be brought in by a relative or some kind of carer, and
Yep.
they will have visitation with their children. But so there were a lot of toys
Yes.
hanging around the space, and toys for kind of different age groups.
Yep.
What we didn't realize until we went through that process was that those toys are a trauma trigger
Right.
because a lot of those women had lost their children or custody of their children because
Yep.
of their own struggles.
Yep.
And so one of the aspects of our design was we still needed toys in the space because
Yep.
it's still visitation, but to create a kind of bespoke storage solution where those toys could all be put away, and they weren't just
Yeah.
visible.
Wow. Like
That
the
was
things that you don't really think about.
no. And
Yep.
that's why the audit process is really important and having that consultation with people in the space. I'll
Yep.
tell you another trauma trigger, which is very common in women's refuges,
Mm.
and that is pool gates. So, you know, those loud clanging metal gates that kind of look
Yep.
like a prison grill. So
Yep.
these are used inside refuges as child safety gates. So child safety is obviously very important
Mm.
in a refuge,
Mm.
but the appearance of those pool gates and the loud banging noise they make can really trigger a trauma response when
Right.
a woman and child has just fled an abusive situation. So at Erin's place, we were able to replace the pool gate that was located closest to the bedroom. So they just, you know, their peace wasn't interrupted by this loud banging.
Yep.
And also, it was the first thing you saw when you walked into
Mm.
the refuge. So we removed that, replaced that. But that's just, I guess, you know, removing trauma triggers is just
Yep.
like one small
Yep.
but very tangible example of how trauma-informed design can have a significant impact on
Well,
someone's emotional well-being. Yeah.
wow. So, another thing that we touched on earlier was HR leaders and executive leaders trying to get people back into the office.
Yeah.
So, what insights can you offer from your work with organizations about creating spaces that encourage return and engagement?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a real challenge for a lot of organizations right now.
Yep.
As I mentioned before with Erin's Place, one of the unexpected um, impacts of the work that we do was that the staff were so much happier to come into that
Yeah.
space. So, you know, working with organizations to understand what it is that might be, you know, a barrier
Yep.
to coming in. But at the moment, we're working with, so this is an example, we're working with the CEO of a not-for-profit standards and accreditation organization who is, you know, working actively to address this challenge. Part of their strategy has been to consult with us to understand what it is that their staff really value in terms of the physical workspace and the barriers to coming back into the office. And obviously, it's not just about being physically present in the office, but also being fully engaged and feeling empowered to do their best work. So
Absolutely.
we've undertaken an audit process that is another audit process that we've created specifically for workspaces. And we've been able to give them specific recommendations that address not just kind of the logistical and functional aspects of people coming back into the office, but also the cultural and psychological and well-being
Mm.
impacts on their people, which I think kind of often gets put in the too hard basket.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand. And I think it's important to note that just as every organization has its own culture, it will
Yep.
have its own workspace requirements, or that you know, their staff will have specific things that they need.
Yes.
But I do think there are some general principles that I can share that might be helpful for
Yes.
people trying to, you know, encourage return to the office and engagement. So firstly, I think something that is sometimes overlooked is really fundamental you know, the environmental conditions in the office that impact physical and mental health if you're in a building for an extended period of time. So,
Mm.
for example, thermal comfort. If people are too hot or too cold, they'll be uncomfortable and they won't be able to do their best work. Lighting is really key. The wrong type of lights can cause headache and
Those little
fatigue. Yeah, those
flickery
little
fluorescent
flickery,
lights.
fluorescent lights.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a lot of science around the impact of that on mental and physical health.
Mm. And
Um,
neurodiversity too.
yeah, neurodiversity, absolutely. Lighting is really key for that, and it's often what I found with neuro diversity, it's often not what you expect. And so that's why the audit process is really important as well, because I'll just give you an example, a personal example. So my daughter is neurodiverse,
Yep.
and one of the kind of general, I guess, recommendations for lighting is to use warmer toned lights because they're calming.
Yes.
But for my daughter, she needs white light because she actually just can't tolerate um, the calming warm light. And I think, well, what we think is because her mind is so busy
Yes.
that white light, which is better for focus and being alert, calms her mind. It makes her mind more alert and more
Yep.
focused. So for her, when everyone else is turning on the warm light, she needs to turn on the white lights to feel
Yes.
calm. So I think this is where the complexity lies as
Yeah.
well
And
in
having
design
different
psychology.
spaces for different people and not being
Different
rigid in
spaces for
like that
different,
whole.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or even having lamps on the desk with
Yes.
different like lighting options so that people can
Yep.
choose what suits their
Yep.
um, the way that they process information better. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the basic environmental conditions. But then, of course, there's the more esoteric aspects of the space, such as how it influences culture
Yes.
of the organization, and of course, how it supports diverse sensory and cognitive processing and learning styles. So, I think they're all important aspects of getting people back into the office, but I do think that the key to engagement is going to be supporting psychological well-being.
Yes.
But obviously, there's a number of ways that we can do that, but I think one of the biggest issues with workspace design in terms of psychological well-being is the rise of open plan and hot desking layouts. So, I mean, there are economic benefits of that, which is why so many organisations have gone down that path. And with
Yep.
hybrid working, it makes sense from a rational point of view.
Yep.
But those layouts work against humans' capacity to focus and connect with their work and connect with other people.
Yep.
So it's understanding how to balance the need for quiet spaces with collaborative spaces, giving people choice so that they can work to their best ability. All of that's going to be really important to enhancing engagement and encouraging people to come back into
Yeah.
the office. But the
Yeah.
first step, I think, is really looking at the space in terms of its psychological impact
Asking
on
them when
people.
you talk about the audit, just ask them what they
Yeah,
want. Like what would,
absolutely. It has to be a collaborative process. But I think where a lot of organizations come unstuck is that everybody's different. And
yeah.
so if they go and ask people without kind of a framework for understanding the information that they're getting, it
Yep.
will just be overwhelming and it'll be like, oh, well, we can't please everyone. So let's just try and please the neurotypical people. And
Mm,
it's complicated without kind of a framework and tools for interpreting that information and translating it into like a practical
yeah. Which is
strategy,
where you come in, right? To
which is where we
help
come in.
make sense of it.
Yes, exactly, exactly. It's
Yeah.
about interpreting that data, analyzing that data, and
Yeah.
it's the same as the work that I've done with organisations on diversity and inclusion, for example, and understanding that. And it's complex. We can't just say that there's a one fits all solution. It's complex, and you know, organisations need help to figure that all out.
Absolutely. So, I mean, one of my last questions we've touched on a little bit, but what's your advice to HR leaders interested in creating more supportive and healing work environments, and how can they support Design for Hope's mission?
I love that question. So, firstly, just about creating more supportive and healing work environments. I think most organisations just aren't thinking about the way that the physical environment might be affecting the health and the well-being of
Yeah.
people, or they may be, but it's sort of a superficial design level. So the issue is that an organisation might have the best well-being strategies and policies in place, and a lot of organisations now are, hiring well-being consultants, for example. They're taking that very seriously. But if the design of the workspace is actually sending a different message to staff, then any other efforts that you make to create a more supportive work environment, they're just not going to get the traction or the outcomes that you expect. But I think even the most glamorous office environment could be detrimental to well-being if, for example, the design unintentionally triggers a trauma response
Yep.
in some people that's making them feel psychologically unsafe.
Yep.
And again, it's kind of that really needs to be explored in a systematic way. So I guess my advice would be to evaluate the physical environment as part of any well-being strategy that you have at work. Now, in terms of supporting Design for Hope's mission, we're always keen to have a conversation with organisations who might be able to partner with us, either
Yep.
by joining us on our projects or funding our renovations, which is always a struggle with women's refuges, or helping to supply some of the products that we specify
Yes.
in the design process. And we are trying to do more and more renovations at domestic and violence refuges. It really is needed,
Yep.
but they are strapped for cash. They don't have the money. They don't have the resources either to do that work. So yeah, if anyone's interested in having a chat with us, that would be great. But also, if you work with us on a project that you have in the design of your work environment, if you want to understand the
Yep.
impact of the environment on well-being, any way that you work with us is supporting that work that we do with women and children's refuges as well.
Wonderful. And your website, Kylie?
Website is designforhope.com.au.
Perfect. So people can get in touch with you there.
Absolutely.
It's been a joy having you today. I really love being able to share the stories and insight into organizations like yours that are truly making an impact in our world. And thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks so much, Emma. I've loved chatting with you before and today. And yeah, I'm really open to anyone getting in touch if they're interested in learning more.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kylie.
Thanks, Emma.
Talk soon.